Welcome everyone to Insight Meditation Community Charlotte, both online and in person here tonight. We're glad to have everybody here. I'm Clyde, one of your Dharma leaders. You're going to have 4 Dharma leaders all together here tonight, but we're doing something a little bit different, where this is the first time we're doing a hybrid panel discussion online and in person, so be patient with us. And I'm going to step away. Debbie's here, Joy's here, and now Ward's going to come up and he'll be part of the panel.
Welcome, Ward.
Thank you, Debbie. Nice to be here. Well, thanks to everybody for joining us. Let me just say, and y'all tell me if you disagree. We've had many excellent questions posed in writing in advance, and that's what we're going to use primarily. And because we are 6 to 8 feet away from this screen, it's not going to be practical for us to use the chat to respond to questions tonight. Is that true? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, sorry we can't be all things to all people, but we hope this will be interesting. Anyone want to begin with the first question?
We haven't talked about how we're going to do this, so I'll take any question you want to.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you,
idea.
Clyde. All right, so
Good idea.
the panel discussion is on how we understand what's happening in Ukraine in the context of the Dharma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the first question is, I heard someone say that we should put those who are causing suffering to millions of people in our metta. I have a hard time with that one. I cannot bring myself to do this.
Go ahead.
I've heard this a lot from a number of people since the war in Ukraine began, and I think it's a really difficult thing to be able to offer metta or tonglen to someone that you see is creating so much suffering in the world. And you know, if we were all bodhisattvas, we would be able to do that, but we're not, and so we're on that path. And what's really important is that if you find that hard, then you don't start. We're already suffering. We're all suffering from what's going on in the world. So you don't want to add to your suffering by then feeling guilty about not being able to offer metta to people that are causing so much pain within the world. So it's just like when we first learn metta. You know, we start with ourselves and then we move on to someone we love, because that's easier then. Our hearts can open, we can feel compassion and love for someone. And then we move on to a neutral person, a person that we haven't had a lot of contact with. And only then, after that, do we move on to someone who's really difficult. And then even then, we don't begin with the person who's really abused us, but someone with whom we have a small difficulty. So, you know, we're taught that in metta, and, you know, at some point, you might be able to get to where you can do it for everyone and for someone who's causing suffering, but that's a process and that's a journey that we're on in moving toward that. So if you can't do it, that's okay. And if you're feeling really bad about not doing it, then it's important to do the metta for yourself.
And I'll just add that really we cultivate metta for our own well-being. It's not like this magical juju goes out there. It does change the relationships in your life, because when you practice metta, loving kindness, it changes you and you take this benevolent heart out. But really the bottom line is to live in non-aversion, so without ill will. So when we carry around a lot of ill will toward people causing a lot of suffering in the world, we're hurting ourselves. So I agree with everything Joy just said. we don't want to go beyond what we're ready to do. But meanwhile, we can just kind of reserve the fact that we are where we are now, and we want to live without the poison of aversion in us. So we do as much loving kindness meditation as we can and go as far with it as we can, and leave the rest till another time in our lives.
And I'll just add one other thought. So this was the most frequent question that we received, and it's awfully important. We aren't going to all speak to every question, but on this one, maybe I will add something, and that is, for me, when I think about people who are behaving very unskillfully, and I work with my aversion toward them, one thing that helps me is to remember times when I have behaved unskillfully, and times when I have had great anger toward another person and maybe acted inappropriately. And so I'd like to think I would never do anything on the magnitude of what's happening in Ukraine, but to connect on a personal level with the fact that we all have unskillful impulses helps me get a foot in the door towards some loving kindness. So, anybody want to read the second question?
How would you respond to someone asking if the suffering from the war is part of their karma?
We can all add to all of them.
Sure.
I think. Mhm.
So, karma is a very complex topic, and many of you, I hope, realize that karma isn't about reward and punishment. Karma is about cause and effect. And the Buddha said, don't try to figure out karma. You'll go crazy if you try to figure it out, because it's so many causes and conditions that come together for everything that occurs in this world. So, yes, everything is karma, and no, it's not punishment, and it's not, the important thing to remember with karma is that we're creating it every minute. We're creating the seeds of our future karma now, so that it's really important what we're doing now rather than looking back at what could have happened before that could have created this moment where I'm experiencing this particular kind of karma. And the Buddha taught that karma is really about intention and what our intentions are. We'll get a little more into that with some of these other questions. But.
Mm-hmm. Just reiterate that it's one of the 4 imponderables because of the past causes and conditions that in the cosmology occur over maybe thousands of lifetimes. It's not, and again, not to think of it as reward or punishment, but we are encouraged to practice a level of karma that we can experience, planting wholesome seeds. So the simplest one for me is just smiling at someone. Just, when you just look at someone and smile, they can't help but give you back a smile. So we want to practice wholesome karma and not try to make sense of the greater karmic fruitions. Mm-hmm.
And I'll add a thought. So one way to understand karma, I think, is everything that happens is the effect of something that has been caused in the past. And maybe that's true, but another thing that I've heard said that makes sense to me is not everything that happens to me is a result of my actions either in this life or in a previous life. Now, those sound contradictory, but for example, when a tsunami comes through and thousands of people are killed, the cause and effect there has to do with weather patterns and not necessarily each individual person's karma. So I don't know that I can say conclusively, but there is that understanding which seems to be supported by some respected teachers. So.
Okay, number 3.
That's pretty much like that, isn't
We've
it?
sort of covered it. I'm having trouble sending metta to the aggressors. Any advice? So we covered that. So we'll go on. 4, are there accounts in the Dharma where the Buddha encountered war? I'll speak to this. So war, I don't know all the suttas, but when I thought about doing this panel with the Ukraine, one of the first things that I thought about is the story of the character, and I'm not going to get the name right anyway, so it's Angulera or something. He was a murderer, and he was, his teacher turned on him because, it's a long story, but I'll try to make it real quick. The students were jealous of him, and the teacher turned on him, and the teacher gave him a task. If you want to be in this school, you have to go and collect 1,000 fingers, the baby finger from 1,000 people. And he went around and murdered people, and he collected them and made necklaces out of them. And one day he had 999, and he saw the Buddha, and he was like, perfect. I'm going to get the great Buddha to be my 1,000th finger. And so he went after him to kill him. And he chased after the Buddha, and the Buddha just walked and walked and walked, and finally, and he couldn't catch up with him. But the Buddha stopped and turned and looked at him, of course with compassion and kindness, and he said, Angula or whatever, that's enough now. And he said, he looked at him, and the Buddha said, and he just was speechless. He put down his weapons and he followed the Buddha. And he became a monk, and he overcame his greed, hatred, and delusion, and he became enlightened. So I just thought of that story, that the Buddha received him. And the moral of the story is that everyone with greed, hatred, and delusion is capable of change. So we all have these poisons, and every one of us is capable of change and becoming enlightened. So I'm sorry that was a long story, but I want to get that out.
Anything you want to say?
What I would say is, as I understand it, there were instances where the Buddha was involved, not in wars, but wars were present. So the Buddha, because of his stature, he had relationships with kings, and kings have kingdoms because of armies. And some of the kings respected him and sought his advice, and some of them didn't respect him and didn't seek his advice. But when his advice was sought, he did try to give direction to steer clear of war. I think that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is, sometimes the suffering makes me numb. Can you offer some reminders about how to maintain emotional and psychological resilience?
You do. You do.
Sure.
So, these kinds of atrocities and tragedies affect us on all levels. It's like physical, psychological, emotional, and we want to do something about that. We want to do something on a practical level. So, it's taught in Buddhism, if you can do something to change a situation, change it. If you can't, you can't. And certainly there are practical things that we can do. I mean, we can make donations to organizations or volunteer for organizations. But on an emotional level, one is to allow ourselves to grieve, allow ourselves to feel what we're feeling, because that's the only way for us to really grow in compassion and open our hearts. If we don't shut down and we let ourselves feel that, it takes a lot of courage, because there's a lot of suffering. I know when the war first started, I was like riveted. I don't ever turn TV on during the day, but I had it on watching the news the first 2 days, and then I was finding that, you know, at night I'd be watching it and I'd be crying, and then I realized that it was too much exposure for me to what was going on. I didn't have to be watching it all the time to feel the compassion, to be sending metta and to experience it. So you know, one of it is to try to limit your exposure if you're finding that it's really stressful on you. And then of course we have all of our tools, our meditation when we're feeling that way, pausing when we're, you know, stopping, feeling what's in our body, allowing ourselves to feel what it is that we're feeling without trying to block it and push it away, but just to be able to stay with that. What some of the things that you might do that help you to cope with these kinds of things. Nature is one of the things that really helps me. When you're feeling like closed in and cramped and everything seems so horrible, to go out and look at the sky, to be able to get more space within you, to feel nature. In fact, I have a poem. That I love this poem, and I thought about this when I saw this question, because I really do find that getting out and being with nature to be very healing. And this is, some of you are probably aware of this poem by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the presence and peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. So I think, you know, whatever in your life can bring you that, whether it's hiking or whatever it might be, to try to do that, to kind of balance out what it is that you might be feeling.
Pretty complete, I think.
I would just offer one thought, which is, I think it's an appropriate response to feel horrified and numb. And so these are the words of Bhikkhu Bodhi, talking about our progress on this path and coming from not being on the path. He says it is a world in which people aspire to live in harmony, but in which their untamed emotions repeatedly compel them, against their better judgment, to lock horns in conflicts that escalate into violence and wholesale devastation. And I think that is the nature of the untrained mind. So it helps me to remember that although this is horrible, it's not surprising.
And we all know how healing sitting meditation is, to cradle our emotions, to not try to push them away and get into an altercation with them, but just feel them and let them have a moment and let them, you know, move on. Doesn't mean they're not coming back, but.
I'd like to just add one more thing, and that is joy. You know, joy is one of the 7 factors of awakening, and you know, along with equanimity and tranquility. And so the Buddha said that, you know, those factors are really important for one to be awakened. And so having joy in your life and not feeling guilty about that when terrible things are going on. You know, we're taught to walk the middle way, and it's so important to have balance in your life and to do what's being joyful. And that's not doing anything that's not respecting or not feeling for all the suffering, but it is really important that we have that in our lives.
Let me ask a question for the three of us. So it's a little bit after 8:20.
Okay.
We've done 5 of 13.
Mhm.
We've been taking them in the order they were submitted.
Mhm.
I
That
would
one,
hate for us not
I
to get to
definitely
number
want to speak
13.
to that
Yeah,
one.
go, yeah. go
Should
right
we
ahead.
do that one
Sure.
now?
Yeah.
There have been so many evils, injustices, genocides, and atrocities in the world for years in various continents. Why are we having a special talk on Ukraine, but not all of the other countries and races? So,
Mhm. I'll speak to that.
yeah.
And in parentheses, African nations and tribes, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Taliban, Uyghurs. So I think it's, when I saw this question, I was really happy that this question was asked, because inherent in our culture is racism. I mean, we have a dominant culture and a subordinate culture. The dominant culture in charge, in power, is white. We connect with Ukraine as an Eastern, potentially soon to be maybe a European country, or in the the EU, and they look like the dominant culture here. I think whenever the question is asked, is there racism in these decisions? The answer is yes. There is. I mean, there is. I think it's an important question to be asked. I think it needs to be asked a lot, all the time, and that's all I can say. I think it's a sad state of affairs, and we need to keep the conversation going.
I agree completely, and I was really glad we got that question. A number of years ago, we used to be members of the Carter Center, and they used to monitor all the wars around the world, and it was just thousands of them were going on, and we never heard about them. And I think that's why, and also there's so much media coverage of this, and and that's in part because of the racism. But so I know we're doing this for Ukraine, but I hope the principles that we're talking about here tonight can be applied to all of the suffering in the world, and that it's our responsibility to do what we can and be aware of what we can. And so I want to read you one more thing, and that's because I thought about this when I saw the question. It's by a poet, Warsan Shire, who wrote, "Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world, and whispered, 'Where does it hurt?' It answered, 'Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere.'"
Thank you. And the Buddha, back in his day, was a very strong caste system, and he came out and said, no matter what caste you're from, whether Brahmin or the lowest caste, you equally can become enlightened. And it was an extremely radical position in his time that he took, and he was very clear that he didn't recognize caste in his path. So I want to mention that.
So let me ask a question.
Sure.
Out of the remaining 6 or 7 questions, why don't we each just choose one?
Pick one? Yeah, that's a good idea.
Does that seem
Mm-hmm.
like a good way?
Yeah.
Who
Why
would
don't you
like
go
to-
next?
Okay, I'll go next. So this is a question which I think is useful. Does sending metta to the Ukrainian people really help? And I would say my understanding is different people understand what happens when we practice metta differently. Some people understand that there's some kind of energetic transmission that occurs that affects the person or people to whom we're sending metta. Other people understand that it changes us And I think people who understand it affects the other also, I think most everybody would agree it changes us. And some people understand it affects the other person too. And what I would say is, I don't think it matters so much whether it helps the people in Ukraine right now. If it does, I'm happy for that. But regardless of the answer to that question, it changes me. I think the Buddha's understanding was, if you want a long-term change in the way we function in the world as people, it takes a long-term commitment. It's a change at the individual level that manifests at the societal level. And so it might be that it is not possible to send a strong enough, energetic intention that it will relieve the suffering in Ukraine. I think that's true. We can't change what's happening that way, but it helps us create a different world, and that does affect the people around us. And if we do that consistently, and if enough people do it, it will have an effect. So that would be my answer.
So.
That was nice.
Yeah, it was. And I'm in the camp that it does make a difference out there, from both from my personal experience and from also recognizing in physics that everything is energy. You know, when we walk into a room, we've walked into a room and it doesn't feel good, or it feels good someplace, you know something's been happening there. What is that? You know, that, so I do believe that, of course, it affects you yourself profoundly, but I'm of the camp that believes that it affects other people as well.
So do you think we have time to do any more?
Do two more?
Because that was kind of a nice conclusion.
What do you think? You want to run over a little, or
What do you guys think? I mean, it's,
any of these that either of you particularly want to?
I think we covered the main ones.
How about, what do you think the Buddha would say is causing war? And and you know, we're taught that about greed, hatred, and delusion. And I think it's, you know, if we look at Putin and the greed, the desire for more power, for more land, you know, the hatred that he has for Ukrainian people, and his delusions about how this is going to change things for Russia and going to change the world. And I think that's a perfect example of seeing all three of them coming together. You know, we all function sometimes from greed or hatred or delusion, but look how powerful it is when it all comes together within one individual and they're in a position where they can focus that. So, you know, it is, you know, it's coming out of, Buddha would probably say, out of ignorance. And so, but I think we can clearly see that all three of those poisons are there.
And I really think it's important that we don't point out there and say, that is a bad guy and I'm like all good. We have to recognize that it's in us for us to do the work of wholesome, you know, cultivation. So, I think take care of each other, be kind to each other, and live, you know, in a wholesome, peaceful way is making a difference in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.